Thank you to those that joined in person and hopefully also to those that watch this at a later date. So today we're going to be covering why procurement needs to care about fungi. And I was actually just discussing with the gang that technically you could even say why people need to care about fungi, because I think we all do. But what I've tried to do in this particular presentation is really help procurement people get the resources they need to be able to do something and take action as soon as this presentation is over. So we've got an action-packed agenda today. So what I'd like to start off by doing is just explaining who the Sustainable Procurement Pledge are, since they're bringing this presentation to you, and just sort of setting the scene really. Then I want to sort of touch on what are fungi and why they're important. And then for the bulk of the presentation, what I'm probably going to do is really start to talk about fungi in relation to helping us solve sustainability challenges and really frame it from how they actually help us maintain or stay within our planetary boundaries, and then go through each of the sort of solutions that fungi provide, and then sort of wrap it up really explaining how these solutions help us maintain within our planetary boundaries. And then if we've got a bit of time, I'll touch on how to be fungi inclusive. And I've also got some sources of information in the pack, which you can see as well. But what I'm planning to do is send this pack round afterwards as a PDF, so people can click on all the sources and links in the pack anyway. And then hopefully we'll have a bit of time for Q&A at the end. You've got an Amanita on the right there. Good. So this has been brought to you by the wonderful Sustainable Procurement Pledge, which is an NGO based in Germany with the mission to ensure sustainable procurement becomes the default. And I would say more importantly, empower procurement professionals to drive change or sustainable change everywhere. And the Sustainable Procurement Pledge has a number of chapters in it. And this particular content is being brought to you by the Nature and Biodiversity chapter. And the purpose of this chapter really is to try and demystify nature for procurement folks and hopefully help them embed nature into their thought process, practices, and processes so that they can buy better. So before I kind of go straight in, I did want to sort of mention something rather monumental that actually happened at the Biodiversity COP16 this year, well, only a few weeks ago, really. And that's that the Fungi Foundation and others were actually petitioning to give fungi equal status to fauna and flora. Now, what I didn't realize before this event, and I felt rather uninformed, was that the grass, for example, in your garden has more rights than fungi, which hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll realize is completely wrong. So please have a look at this resources. So there was a good article in The Guardian and also in Forbes talking about why it's important to get fungi equal status. And then actually at the event, the Fungi Foundation actually were giving out this wonderful document called Contribution of Fungi to the Global Biodiversity Framework, which sort of sums up some of the concepts that we're going to talk about today, and is a great article for your organizations as well to read. So what are fungi and why are they important? So the first thing to probably mention is that they are their own kingdom. And if you actually look back at the tree of life when all sort of life on Earth started, you'll start to see that in actual fact, fungi are much closer to animals than they were to plants. And if you sort of look into fungi, you can understand why. So their walls are made out of chitin, which is the same as insects and crustaceans. They actually store their food as glycogen, which is the same as animals. We store our food as glycogen as well. Plants store it as starch. They're heterotrophs, meaning that they gain their nutrients from other organisms. And what their mycelium does, so their root structures, it secretes an enzyme that dissolves their food so that they can then absorb it into their cells. And that's quite similar to the way that some spiders eat as well. And probably the fact that I always find most interesting is that they share electrical impulses through their mycelium, through their roots, in a very similar way to the way that our brain sends electrical impulses to coordinate behavior, sensation, thoughts, and emotions. And on the right there, you'll see a caterpillar fungus. And Andrew Adamatsky, what he's been doing is he's been trying to show these electrical impulses. And he's been able to show through various studies that he's done that the electrical impulses of fungi is very similar to the electrical impulses that we send out when we're speaking. So there does seem to be some form of communication going on, which is very sci-fi and exciting. So there are really four types of fungi, and I think when we break them down into their types, you start to realize the importance of them in relation to the eco services that they provide the world. So the first type is saprotrophic fungi, and these are the great recyclers and decomposers. Um, and if you were to take them all away in one go, we would literally be drowning in dead matter because we're absolutely reliant on them to actually take all our dead matter and convert it into useful substances that really every organism can then use on the planet. The second type are mycorrhizal fungi, and I call these the symbiotes. And these fungi partner with various plants around the world and in essence enact a sort of trading system where the fungi gives the plant its nitrogen and phosphorus and the plant in return gives it its carbohydrates, its sugars and fats, which the fungi then eats. And 80% of plant life is reliant on mycorrhizal fungi. So again, if you were to flick a switch and kill off all the mycorrhizal fungi, it is likely that 80% of the plants in this world would also die. So that's the second huge eco service that fungi actually provide. The third type is endophytic, and I call these guys the hitchhikers. So they tend to live in other organisms. And what's exciting about these types of fungi is that they often provide sort of novel active compounds, which are actually quite useful to the pharmaceutical sector. And again, what sometimes goes sort of unnoticed is the fact that a lot of our active ingredients in medicines actually come from fungi. So antibiotics come from a fungi. So generally, if you are allergic to mushrooms, you then can't do antibiotics and you have to do phage therapy instead, as an example. Statins also come from fungi as well, and they're now given out like sweets. You've got cyclosporin, which is an organ transplant rejection medicine, which also comes from fungi. So in short, if we didn't have fungi, we wouldn't have organ transplants. And then sadly, you've got your fourth type of fungi, which is parasitic. And I would say these are the ones that give fungi, sadly, the bad name sometimes. So you've got ash dieback killing off our ash trees. And let's say on humans, for example, you've got pesky little fungi like ringworm, athlete's foot, that sort of thing that unfortunately you don't want, sadly. So those are the four types of fungi we have really in the world. So how can fungi help us stay within our planetary boundaries? So we got chicken of the woods on the right there. So this is kind of a snapshot of how our planetary boundaries are being exceeded over time. And as you can see on the right, we're not doing very well. And probably the big takeaway I'd give to procurement folks watching this now is that we are very obsessed about Scope 3 and climate change. And the reality is that we need to do a lot more everywhere. And my view is that fungi can definitely help us stay within our planetary boundaries if we understand them and utilize them better. And I do want to just talk through some of these terms because they're not always immediately evident. So with novel entities here, this is really nasty chemicals, for example, going into the environment that are causing harm, for example, microplastics. For biosphere integrity, probably a simpler way to sort of translate this is biodiversity availability. And biogeochemical flows is very much a disruption of natural nutrient cycles in various environments. So a really good idea of this is too much nitrogen and phosphorus running off from farms, getting into waterways, creating algae blooms, suffocating fish. That's a bad example of a biogeochemical flow as an example. And I believe fungi can actually solve some of these crises. So I'm now going to talk about the different solutions that fungi can provide. And I'm going to start off with how they can help us with our agricultural and food challenges. So we've got an amethyst deceiver there on the right. So two things that generally keep me up at night, I would say, isn't Scope 3 climate change. It tends to be the acidification of the ocean because people don't seem to realize that the ocean provides us with most of our oxygen. So if the ocean gets degraded anymore or too much, that's going to actually impact our ability to live. And probably the second one as well is soil degradation, because if we keep losing topsoil, we're not really going to be able to feed ourselves. And sadly, we've lost already 30% of the topsoil that we used to have to actually grow things. And this is going down day by day. And obviously our population is getting bigger. And then this is sort of exacerbated by the fact that even today we have terrible malnutrition and it's currently on the rise. And if you look at rates of anemia, which is normally a good indicator of malnutrition, it's actually quite high everywhere, although rates of it, I would say, in countries that you wouldn't even expect. So when I saw this heat map, I was really shocked that we even had mild anemia, for example, in the UK. Now, interestingly enough, the only country that doesn't seem to have it is the United States. And that got me thinking, is it because they eat more beef? This isn't a beef conversation, but it did get me thinking that. Right. So I think we have two things that we need to try and solve for. One is improving our soil ecology and making sure that we can increase agricultural yields so we don't keep cutting things down. And the second one is really, how do we feed our overall global population while maintaining sufficient nutritional intake levels? And I think fungi can actually help us solve these two solutions. And I'm going to start with the first one. So when you look at agricultural crops, they generally get their nutrition in three ways. The first one is the standard way, so agricultural fertilization, which is putting phosphorus and nitrogen in the soil. And it's generally perceived as inefficient, simply because often the wrong amounts are put on the soil, so you get runoff and pollution. The second type is regenerative. So this is where, for example, you're spreading manure on your field, or sort of a smaller example would be if you have an orchard, you let your chickens run around your orchard, they eat the aphids, they poop everywhere, they give the soil nutrients, and obviously your apple trees stay healthy. And that's a nice sort of mini ecosystem. That's a good example of regenerative farming. And then your third one is really mutualistic relationships with fungi. So these are symbiotic fungi, which is the ones I want to talk about. So that all our crops, well, the majority, I should say, of our crops and grasses within the agricultural sector generally partner with one type of fungi, which is our buscular mycorrhizal fungi. And what this fungi does is it enhances nutrient and water uptake because the plant's roots, in short, can't penetrate deep enough into the soil to get the level of nutrients it needs. So what the fungi does is it sort of acts as an extension of its roots and then creates that sort of trading relationship with the plant. It also makes the plant more resistant. So I think a really nice example comes from Merlin Sheldrake's book about, and I might not do it service, about broad bean plants, where one broad bean plant was being attacked by aphids, as an example. But because it was connected, all the broad bean plants were connected by the fungal network under the soil. When one broad bean plant got attacked, the fungi were able to send a sort of communication, shall we say, to the other broad bean plants that then allowed them to release plant defense chemicals that then reduced the amount of aphid attack to all the others before they were even being attacked. And this is really how fungi really helps the plants, in addition to making sure it has enough nutrients so that it can sort of resist disease as well. They also enhance the soil ecology because obviously they're moving nutrients around. And they actually represent, or should represent, between 20 and 50% of the biomass in the soil. So the reason I have a picture of a tractor there is that if you till and plow your soil, you're basically going in there and cutting up all your mycorrhizal fungi, and in essence, cutting up your plant's ability to actually feed itself through its fungal partners. Fungi also help decrease leaching, meaning that they sort of contain the good nutrients in the soil by up to 50%. And they also contribute to 80% of plants' phosphorus supply. And this is, again, a really more important fact, I should say, or another important fact, because in actual fact, phosphorus supplies are depleting horribly as well, which is another reason why we should really care about these fungi partners. And just to add more pain to the mix, I would say, our buscular mycorrhizal fungi are actually decreasing, which is actually quite concerning because this is exacerbating our ability to improve soil ecology and actually increase agricultural yields globally. So one lovely chap called Dr. Adam Cobb wanted to find out why this was actually happening. And so he conducted a study in Zambia using sorghum, which is a type of grain that they have out there. So I just want to talk through his study here. So on the left side, you have the yield. So how much sorghum was produced in essence. And on the right side, you have the amount of fungi that colonized the sorghum, so that had created partnerships. So if I talk through the left side first, so you have two types of sorghum in the study. You have the green one, which is land raised. So this is the non-GMO sorghum. And then the blue one is the GMO version, so the one that's been commercially modified. So when the sorghum wasn't fertilized, you'll see that the land raised one produced quite high yields. And understandably, the GMO one produced lower yields. And the simple reason for this is that often genetically modified crops are probably adapted in a manner to cope with agricultural practices like man-made fertilization. On the right side, you'll see that when then fertilization was added, so nitrogen, phosphorus was added, understandably the GMO one's yield went up. But interestingly enough, the land-raised one went down a little bit, which I find quite interesting. Then if you go to the right side and you actually look at the fungal colonization, and if I just sort of draw your attention really to the groups that were fertilized, you'll see that the rate of fungi goes down considerably, which suggests that, and this is obvious because why would a fungus stay with a plant if it's getting its nitrogen and phosphorus? Because there's no trading relationship. But then if you go to the ones that were not fertilized, you'll see that the land-raised ones had significantly more partnerships with their mycorrhizal friends, let's say, compared to the GMO ones. And I think the point that Dr. Adam Cobb sort of took away from this study is that potentially our GMO crops are inadvertently being changed in a manner that's actually not enhancing fungal partnerships and is actually decreasing fungal partnerships. And that is creating potentially a serious problem and actually impacting our yields globally, potentially. So what can we do about this? So I think firstly, I think if you work in the agricultural space and if you're a procurement person that works for let's say a GMO corporation, I think the first one is to start sort of lobbying, I would say, for mycorrhizal relationships to be taken into account into selective crop breeding programs. The second thing is, instead of actually just using nitrogen and phosphorus as fertilizers, could we actually spend more time working on increasing the fungi in our soil and actually using them as a biofertilizer as well? Now, I always find that we often focus very much on the symptom and not the cause. So we focus on deforestation, which is the cutting down of trees. But really, what we should be focusing on is the fact that we're not increasing our yield, which is why we have to cut down more trees. So if we actually focused on improving yield, so I want to give this example because what I've done at the bottom here is I've put your standard crops that are normally affected by deforestation. And I'm going to call out palm oil, which is the second one in. Wouldn't it be quite interesting if we worked out what fungal partners palm oil has and then actually focused on increasing those fungal partners to improve the yield of our palm plantations so that we don't have to keep worrying about deforestation? I think that would actually be a more efficient way to do it. And so what I've done here on the right is I've actually shown you the biggest sort of GMO corporations globally that could hopefully do something about this. And I'm delighted to say that Bayer is a sponsor of the SPP. So I'm hoping that when they finally hear this message, they might be inclined to go away and do something about it, which would be awesome. Good. So a good source of information here is a wonderful lady called Toby Kears from the Spun organization, and she really sort of breaks down the trading relationships between plants and fungi and sort of likens it to sort of our capital markets, but sort of concludes that fungi are a lot less capitalist. So it's a great one to watch later. So I'm just going to jump into the second one. So we need to be able to feed our population. So how can we do it? And I think there's a recognition that beef produces great quantities of iron in comparison to other foods. It also produces heme iron, which you can't get in other foods. And so I think we have to take a step back and recognize that in order to have alternatives to beef, or to have an alternative to beef, we have to have different foods, really. So we don't have one solution, in short. So we have to sort of spread our bets, in short. And I believe fungi, or in particular mushrooms and microproteins, can actually support with this activity. But why can they support? So on the right side, I've put the iron content of some mushrooms. So again, it's never going to be as good as beef, although there is one type that sort of exceeds it if dried. But generally, they do have quite a good iron content. They tend to use a lot less land when you grow them. Plus, you can grow them underground, which is brilliant. They have a brilliant balance of essential amino acids compared to many foods, although it is still lower than beef. They're a great source of vitamin B, vitamin D if you UV your mushrooms when you're growing them, zinc, selenium, and antioxidants. The downside, sadly, is that they do use more energy. And I think when you look at the LCAs that are available, this is probably down to the fact that we have a lot of new startups that are sort of using energy and perhaps haven't converted to renewable energy yet. So it is something that can be fixed. And corn, for example, has actually shown that they can reduce their environmental footprint significantly. And they've been doing this for quite a few years. And probably the last benefit I would say is that microprotein can be molded to represent meat texture, which again sort of showcases the fact that fungi are a lot more like animals than they are plants. And what I've done here is I've just shown really what I've just talked through, which is that microproteins do have generally an overall improved environmental footprint than other meats out there, in short. And it's the orange one, by the way, the microprotein, or the fifth one down if you're colorblind. And again, the only problem there is energy consumption, which is still quite high or nearly the same as beef. And I think that's because it's still in its infancy and we need to improve the way that mushrooms are farmed, in short. So if you are a food category manager and you're sat there wondering how to contribute to your company's sustainability targets, the first thing you can do, especially if you're buying meats, is actually consider bringing in microproteins into your category, because they will considerably reduce the amount of emissions that you are emitting in your scope 3 customer emissions. And what I've done here is I've provided just a few companies so you can immediately go off and start to look these up. Most of them are in America. Fable's down under, Meatless Kingdom is in Indonesia, and Biona's, funnily enough, just down the road from me in the UK. The one sort of caveat here is that EU regulation for novel foods, and unfortunately microproteins get counted as novel foods, is incredibly strict and hard to sort of get through if you're a small startup. So I think if you're a large company looking to diversify your portfolio, your food portfolio, you should be prepared to help startups sort of break into the EU market, because they do need your help. I also wanted to call out the Fungi Protein Association, which is a great place if you are based in the US for finding all the sort of microprotein organizations that exist. And there's actually more than you could probably imagine. And then there's another good website, which is MycoStories, who have very kindly tried to collate every single fungi-based organization globally and put it on a wonderful poster so you can find it really easily. And what's so shocking about this, or at least shocked me, was just the amount of companies that are sort of working in this space and are probably not getting the investment and exposure needed to actually make this more commonplace. So please try and make it more commonplace, I would say. Another good source of information is Mr. Paul Shapiro from the Better Meat Company, who provides a lovely TED talk on why fungi can disrupt, I would say, the meat industry, and why it makes sense to sort of pay attention to this. So you can watch that in your spare time. Right, fungi is a nature-based solution. On the right there, you have a yellow staghorn. This is my favorite part in the presentation, would you believe it? Right, so the first thing to say is that fungi act as huge carbon storers. It's immense. So if I just sort of bring your attention to the green box on the screen, it is estimated that 13.12 gigatons of CO2 are currently allocated to underground mycelium of mycorrhizal fungi. So that equates to 36% of sort of man-made emissions annually. So to put that in context, if you look at WRI stat on sort of forests currently capture 7.6 gigatons. Okay. I must admit, when I looked up ocean stats, there wasn't really a lot of consensus, but it was roughly, I would say, so don't quote me on this, but it was roughly 25%. So the moment I actually saw this statistic, I thought to myself, "Oh my God, this is the reason we have to have this presentation alone, is because we have our best allies here at solving climate change, and sadly, no one knows about it." So if you actually look at fungi, they only represent a meager 0.2% of our global conservation priorities. It's really quite shocking. And if I take you back to this, and if I show you our buscular mycorrhizal fungi here, which are our sort of the ones that partner with our crops, what this means is that if we actually focus on improving our mycorrhizal fungi for our crops and improving yield, what we will also be doing is actually capturing significant amounts of CO2. So you'll actually be getting two birds with one stone here. And funny enough, the ones that capture the most are the ectomycorrhizal fungi that are linked or partner with broadleaf trees, a bit like your large English oak, as an example. So again, for those looking at reforestation, don't just look at the tree, also look at the fungi partner and which ones are actually capturing the most the most carbon into the soil. So I thought for fun, it would be good to then look at all the nature-based frameworks, considering this big statistic, and actually think about, do any of them mention fungi? So first of all, what I first made sure they did is that they mentioned trees and forests, because if they're not mentioning trees and forests, they obviously aren't going to mention fungi. And I was horrified to see that no one mentions fungi, even though supposedly they're our largest allies in actually combating climate change. Oxford University, however, was brilliant. So in their nature-based solution initiative, not only did they have a few case studies, but they also had the types of KPIs that you can actually include in your nature-based activities. So well done, Oxford. I then thought I took it a stage further and then thought, why didn't I look at all the articles that talk about nature-based solutions and then see if they mention fungi, and some of them actually mentioned the word forest over 100 times. No mention of fungi apart from one in the middle, which mentioned it once. So well done them, which is getting the message right on nature-based solutions to climate change. So what this tells us is that we're not paying enough attention to, quite frankly, a creature that can actually help us solve a lot of the issues that we're currently being faced with. So as procurement professionals, what does this mean? So I know it's hard to think that we can make a difference, but the reality when it comes to solving nature problems, they're very much in the supply chain. So I think as a procurement professional, the first thing you can ask for is, when we're being given nature-based frameworks and solutions, are fungi being included in them? So just ask for it. The second one is ask for case studies, because the more case studies we have on fungi and how they can actually how they can solve planetary issues, the more it will become commonplace and the more people will start to recognize the importance of fungi and hopefully use them in these solutions. Purple jelly brain fungus on the right there. So I'm just going to go through a few solutions. So the first thing is you can go talk to some big hitters in this world, which is the Fungi Foundation and SPUN. The Fungi Foundation very much is, I would say, more corporate friendly. They tend to focus on public policies and actually promoting fungi and their role across humanity and the globe, I would say. And then SPUN tends to be slightly more scientifically focused, doing more research, but they provide an incredible service, which is to try and map the mycorrhizal fungal communities globally so that one, we can understand what's where, and then how is it impacting positively that ecosystem so we can do something good about it, in short. The second solution, which I think is brilliant and probably one of my favorite ones, is by Funga. So the CEO of Funga used to work at SPUN, interestingly enough. And what they do is, if you have a nature-based solution, they'll go and figure out what fungi you need. They'll go and get you that fungi. They'll inoculate whatever seedlings you're planting, and then they'll look at the rate or the improved rate of growth or yield based on the fact that you had those fungi added, and they can give you a carbon credit. So that's a lovely off-the-shelf solution for what I would say corporates. Many people will say, well, that sounds very much like offsetting. So if I can just explain this. So if you, for example, have palm oil in your supply chain and you've got down to the farm and you want to increase the yield of your palm oil, and you use fungi to do that as an example, because it is your farm in short, and it affects your direct supply chain, that carbon credit does go towards your science-based target initiative. If, however, you don't have, let's say, pine trees in your supply chain, but you want to go and sort of do some carbon capture with pine trees and sort of add fungi to your pine trees, that would be considered offsetting. So it's whether you can actually trace it down to your supply chain. So this is a great solution for corporates to actually start doing immediately, I would say. The second one, unfortunately, they don't do carbon credits, and they're only based in the UK and Australia, but I did think it was worth mentioning, is Rhizocore. So what these guys do is they kind of provide off-the-shelf pellets. So if you are doing tree planting activities in either of those countries, I would strongly advise you buy some pellets if you're tree planting and make sure you include it, because a lot of saplings don't make it in tree planting projects, sadly, and this would certainly give them a fighting chance. Then probably the last one in this section is, if you're keen on actually supporting efforts, you can actually invest in fungi startups or fungi-based startups on the left with the Fungi Investment Collective. And if you're working with fungi-based startups, or you want to start working with fungi-based startups, you can actually send them over to the Fungi VC, where they will be able to access funds. And then you can invest in the Fungi Investment Collective. So it sort of creates a nice financial ecosystem. And this is where I got that wonderful stat, 36% was from this paper here. So I would encourage anyone working on nature, or even in procurement, that has a sort of high nature focus, to actually go off and read this paper. So another great source of information here is Colin Averill from Fungi, where he talks about the relationship between forests and fungi. Good, so I'm just going to jump into fungi as an alternative material. Hopefully this one resonates with procurement people, because they are off-the-shelf solutions here. So the one that I think most people are used to seeing now, or have seen, one will hope, is fungi as an alternative to polystyrene packaging. And you've got some great examples of companies that are doing sort of alternative polystyrene packaging on the right there. Just a few stats on this type of packaging. So you can grow it in 7 days. It is a fraction of the cost to mold. It is flame resistant, and I think that's a really big hitter for mushroom packaging. I'll come on to explain why. It's naturally water resistant, which you wouldn't expect. It's fully compostable at home, and it's an active soil amendment. So if I try and explain that, so many plastics that are compostable are not an active soil amendment, meaning that when they get broken down to their constituent parts, they're sort of dead matter. They don't do anything. They're inert. They don't do anything positive. If you break down your mycelium, it does something positive. It adds nutrients back into the soil. And then finally, the shelf life is well over 10 years, which I didn't even know about, which I thought was fantastic if kept in the correct conditions. The only downside I would say about all of this is the fact that it takes 7 days to grow. So you can make polystyrene faster. So if you are considering this sort of thing, you need to consider that into your lead times. Right, I'm going to flip through the next slides, because what I also want to just kind of explain to people is that when people think of mycelium for packaging, they think of some sort of foamy substance, sort of spongy substance. And the reality is mycelium can be grown into hard substrates as well. So here's an example of mycelium as floor tiles. There's acoustic panels. Here it is as a for insulation in homes, for example. So we need to try and make all our homes more energy efficient. Admittedly, it is a long life product, but if you can actually use mycelium instead of the nasty stuff that generally goes into insulation, it means at the end of the life, at the end of its life, you can actually recycle it better, or put it back into the ground and then it recycles, as opposed to having to burn it or bury it. You also can create building materials from it. So you can create structural insulation cladding sheathing. And although I don't have it in this particular presentation, there are examples of it being changed. It's not grown, I would say, into breeze blocks in Africa to make housing. Quite niche, but also quite cool. You've also got it being grown into wood. So this is micro wood, which is the same as plywood, basically. And the wonderful thing about Commu Labs here is that they lease or give you a little laboratory where you can actually grow your wood on site. So instead of, let's say, getting it transported all the way from Sweden to a paper mill, then turned into a composite and then over to you, you can actually have it on your site and actually be growing the wood as you need it, which I think is fantastic and would reduce CO2 emissions considerably. It's also a great, I would say, alternative material. Often you've seen it as leather, and I think bolt threads was probably the big one that was in the news a few years ago. And what I've learned in this space really is that there isn't really enough investment. And I think the growing cycle also puts people off. So I think we just need to understand the fact that we need different types of substrates. We can't just keep relying on one type of material. I think we have to diversify as much as possible. And I think mushrooms do provide that alternative. The one I love is a wooden coffin. So this Dutch company has just come up with a mycelium-based coffin. I'd certainly want to be buried in this because not only will my body then add nutrients to the soil, but so will my coffin, which is awesome. Right, and here's again, Myco Stories provides you with all the companies you can go away and Google and find out about and hopefully include in your portfolio if you're a category manager working in any of these spaces. Right, fungi is a solution to solving pollution. This one I would say is still in its infancy, but it's such an important one because it helps with novel entities. So what is mycoremediation? So mycoremediation is really the use of fungi to neutralize and degrade nasty things in nature, in short. So here are some examples. So it's been used to remove E. coli from water, and they tested it on the Chicago River water. It's great for filtering from water runoff. So for example, if you have too much phosphorus or nitrogen in your soil, it can remove it before going into the waterways. It's been used to get rid of heavy metals and petroleum waste as well. So oyster mushrooms always feature a lot in these mycoremediation efforts. And it's also been shown to actually get rid of diesel. So this is great when you have oil spills. And Paul Stamets here not only showed that it got rid of all the diesel, but he actually showed that it became a sort of biodiverse, rich field afterwards, in short, which is a great story. Miller Anderson has developed the Mycomat, which actually gets rid of bitumen mine waste. And Savannah Volkov has actually been focusing on getting rid of PAH, which is a byproduct of plastic, using mushrooms as well. So all this is in its infancy, and the reason for that is that when you're actually using these kind of systems, you have to do it in a controlled environment because obviously you don't want to introduce too much fungi suddenly to an ecosystem because you don't know how that ecosystem will react. So we need more investment in this space. So I think if you're an innovative corporate watching this, please try and invest in the research. It's so important. But if you don't think you're going to be able to, there are some companies that, let's say, are slightly ahead of the game here. So myco farming would be brilliant if you're working in the agricultural space and you want a way to clean your water before it runs off and potentially pollutes rivers. Mycomine, mycosal, and to an extent novobiome, novobiome's not as much, but mycomine and mycocycle have developed a way of understanding what your waste problem is. They'll then actually find the fungi that can cope best with that waste, and then they'll train it to convert it into inert substances that can then be used for other organisms. The Life Mysore project is focusing on petrochemicals, and Tenkate Aquivia is focusing on aquatextile runoff waste. So people to get involved or contact as soon as you can, I would say. And Mycocycle does a lovely, I think it's a 7-minute video on what mycoremediation is as well, so you can find out more afterwards. So I just want to really recap on what we covered. So this is a let me get this right, drumstick truffle club fungus on the right there. It actually grows on truffles, but sadly it doesn't grow on the truffles that we eat. So don't eat the truffles. Right, so here are our planetary boundaries. So I just wanted to sort of go back to this. So I said we've got fungi as a solution to our agricultural and food challenges. So how does it help us maintain or stay within our planetary boundaries? Well, the first one is climate change. We know they're great sequesterers. We know that they actually improve the topsoil biodiversity. If we're increasing agricultural yields, it means we've got less land system changes. And if fungi are being relied upon to actually fertilize and give nutrients to our plants, it means we have less danger of having biogeochemical flow problems and fresh water change problems as well. Fungi is a nature-based solution. So here, the big one here is climate change. We should really be using fungi more. And not only that, but it would actually, again, be improving topsoil if we were doing it. If we use fungi as an alternative material, again, because they actually have much lower carbon footprint than many things, what that means is that you are probably sequestering carbon while you grow your fungi, but hopefully because you're not using standardized materials that do require land system changes, for example, cutting down your pine trees, you can obviously reduce that as well by actually using more fungi as an alternative material, or at least one type of alternative material. And then solving the pollution crisis, although I would say still in its infancy, it can solve the novel entities coming into the environment. So something, again, that we really need to start investigating more of. Again, they sequester lots of carbon, so it can help with climate change. We've covered biosphere integrity. And then again, because we're actually taking pollution out of the environment, it means that we are supporting with freshwater changes, or making sure that our freshwater isn't changed to something nasty, and also reducing the problems that we have currently with biogeochemical flows. So, for example, farm runoff. So hopefully that kind of sums up really how fungi currently are helping us. How to be fungi inclusive. So on the right here, you have a common dog lichen. So I just wanted to call this out because I think it's quite interesting. So lichens are a symbiotic relationship between often more than one fungi, algae. So this is how plants originally got onto land, was through lichens, and often bacteria. And although you just see one organism there sort of sat on top of some moss, it's actually 3 different organisms working in perfect tandem to create one organism. And what I love about lichen is it actually sort of brings into question the philosophical debate about what is self, what is one person, what is a human? Is it us, is it our minds, or is it all the fungi and a microbiome in our stomachs keeping us alive, as an example? So I think that's always an interesting thought. Right. I won't digress. So the Fungi Foundation, which I've mentioned already, are great for sort of corporate resources. So they, as I said, are really petitioning to help people understand the importance of realizing that fungi needs to be considered equally as important, in some ways, if not more important, than flora and fauna. And what you can immediately do as an individual is jump on their site and actually pledge that you actually think it should be included and protected. And then if you love what you've heard or think it's something that needs to be investigated more, you can actually download their guide on how to become more mycologically inclusive. So we all have sort of diversion, equity and inclusion sort of activities going on for people. I think we should also do the same for the other organisms on this planet. And they also provide you an email as well, so you can immediately get in touch with them and just ask for help, and they are very helpful. So I would certainly encourage it. Here are some other good sources of information that you can just go and look at in your spare time as well, or clickable as well. But what I will do, Charlotte, is I'll just go to Q&A because I've whipped through that just to allow people to ask questions and hopefully end the session on time. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma, and Marina. Hop in anytime as our second co-chair as well for this chapter. That was incredible. You've absolutely blown my mind with all of the different things, and we've got a couple of questions. So what you have done brilliantly, Emma, is you've given very much kind of a corporate, a few hints and tips of what we can do with our work hats on. But Peter is actually asking a question, and Peter, you can unmute yourself if you like and add to the question about, are there any practical steps we can take to encourage or not discourage fungi in our gardens? Is it worth doing for us and the planet? Do you have any tips there?
It's really weird actually, because you can actually go into the light. I don't know where you're based, but for example, be a garden centre and actually find pellets that have mycorrhizal fungi in them. So yes is the answer. You can potentially do that. And I have a friend that a friend of a friend that actually went off and actually bought it and did that. I can't tell you about its efficacy though. That's the only downside. That's my caveat there. But yes, there are solutions there.
I grow many sorts of mushrooms in my lawn accidentally.
Oh, excellent. You've got a healthy lawn.
And no, I think, well, I'm not sure a healthy lawn. It's a lawn with not a lot of grass in it, I think is the key.
I think that is a healthy lawn, though. That's what I'm telling myself, because mine is minimal grass, a lot of moss, and lots of, well, other things, and a few mushrooms and fungi in between.
Yeah, indeed. It was a brilliant presentation, Emma. Thank you so much.
That's all right. Glad you enjoyed it.
Really brilliant. I see a few people typing away. Margaret, you had also a question, bringing it then back to the kind of corporate world. For those of us that source agri products, what's your recommendation for standards we might consider for purchasing?
Agricultural products. Oh gosh, Marguerite. What are the types of things? Do you know what? I think it might be too soon for that, really, in my mind. I think what we actually have to do is get to the scientists of these organizations to actually make sure that the selective breeding programs are actually considering this. I'd say that's probably step one. Step two, as a buyer, well, instead of, let's say, rushing to go and buy nitrogen and phosphorus to go and put on your field, what you might want to do is actually go and contact Fungi, I would say, and actually ask them, if I wanted to increase my fungal communities, what would you suggest? And actually use fungi as a sort of biofertilizer. That's probably what I would do. So it's not so much standards, because unfortunately, I don't think enough people have done this. So you would be leading the charge, I would say, but that's what I would do if I worked in one of these companies. I'd immediately go and talk to them and find out, what can I do and what is the cost versus let's say just pouring nitrogen and phosphorus on my fields.
I think the really cool thing that you've done with this presentation, and as Emma said, we'll make this available to you via our SPP website. If you go to Connect, you can go to all of our different chapter pages and you'll find resources there. So we'll pop this presentation and the recording up on there. So do go and visit the website afterwards in the next few days. What you did a brilliant job of, Emma, is adding in loads of touch points and giving kind of indications of where we might want to go, both as individuals and companies, to perhaps start those conversations. As you say, it's very pioneering.
Great. I can't see anyone, but guys, thank you so much for joining. And all I can ask here is I will. So do look out for so Charlotte will very kindly be putting the video on our channel. And what we'll also be doing is saving the PDF there, but I will also send you the PDF directly as well, if you don't mind. And please just encourage more people to watch this. This is the key now, is to get the message out, because I don't think enough people know it. That's my ask of all of you on the call today. Thank you.